It's working. All right, I'm getting off this call.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. We are now streaming live. Yay! So sorry, folks.
Uh,
We had a lot of technical difficulties there, but we are live now and we are ready to have this conversation. So let's give it a few minutes for people to figure out that we're here. And if you've got questions right off the bat, you can go ahead and put those in the comments. We're going to be talking about racism and education tonight.
Juicy topic.
Juicy topic. Yep,
It's a
we got
lot.
lots
It's a lot
lots
to talk
planned for
about.
this conversation. We really wanted to have it. And we can both be heard. Yay. Thanks to your dad. Yes, so we understand JT has a very soft voice. This is always something we work with when we do videos together. He's going to try his mic on his headset, which looks a little weird, but hopefully you'll be able to hear him better tonight. All right,
Yeah.
so we'll just get going. This is a pet topic of JT's because this is what his degrees are in. This is what he's been working to do is work with student leadership in academia. So he has a lot of information about this. He has a lot of knowledge. I have nothing. I'm his student tonight, right along with the rest of you. And I will be asking questions and kind of pulling information out of him because he's got lots of great information in there. All right. Hey, Laura. Hey, Melanie. Good to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Sometimes.
All right, JT, you ready? We're going to start right off tonight. Oh, maybe we should introduce ourselves. So I'm Mary
Oh, is it
Klopstock,
back?
and I'm here with my
Yes.
son, JT Klopsick. He is adopted, so he's grown up black in a white family, and we have that unique perspective to share. There's a lot of kind of added issues to the racism issue, and we'll get into some of that tonight. JT, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. My name is JT. This is my mom. Yeah. Talk about education from all the way, I think. Keeping it broad in general.
Your mic up because we can't
Feel
hear
free to
you.
ask. Ah, yeah.
All right, we're going to dive in. And the first thing we're going to talk about, because it's sort of the foundation of talking about what happens in education for people of color, for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, BIPOC, if you've ever seen that acronym, that's what that
Good
means
term.
Black, Indigenous, people of color, BIPOC. So those are pretty much all of the all of the people of color categories that we see in our country. So systemic racism is the foundation of what we're talking about tonight. So can you talk to us about what do you mean by systemic racism? What does that term mean?
Yeah. So broken down, um, a system of racism. So when we look at it from the lens of our country, the United States, we're really examining how our country is systemically against, systemically challenges people of color, specifically Black people, from our origins all the way up until now. And this manifests lots of different ways. I would say especially within our educational settings, within our big institutional settings, any kind of institution, so a church, a school, and
Prisons.
organizations, prisons, yes. And last time we talked about people in power, the people that need to make the change and learn all this stuff. So I think this is exactly that. It's systemic because of the people in power have yet to make the changes that necessary.
All right, so give us some historic context for racism in education. When, where did this start?
So I think when we talk about racism in education, I think, at least for me personally, use I language, for me personally, the thing that comes to mind is access. Um, so going all the way back, for whatever reason, way back, um, people of color did not have access to go to schools, the same schools that white people would. Um,
Well, going way back, people of
like
color
often,
weren't permitted to get an education.
exactly, exactly. And then maybe we advance a little more, and then we have laws like Jim Crow. So then education is still limited to people of color. And then we move forward a little more into redlining and segregation, where education is more accessible. Um, but even though it's more accessible, it's not necessarily the same quality. And we just sort of see these things compounded and repeated over and throughout history. Even in today's, I think access is still huge, huge, huge. Um, like when we really sit back and look at it, like who has access to good schools, who has access to things like textbooks, who has access to quality tutors, who has access to send their kids or to go to private school, from elementary school all the way up into high school.
All right,
And
let's
then,
back up a little bit before we get
okay,
to access even. And you mentioned that word redlining. Can you tell us what redlining is?
yeah. So hopefully we're all familiar with Jim Crow, but after that, um, it
Well,
really started.
maybe we're not all familiar with Jim Crow. Maybe we are that white that we don't know. So let's make the assumption we don't know what that means. Or maybe we've heard the term, we've heard the name, and we don't understand the impact of it or the
Okay,
import. So talk about the Jim Crow laws first, I guess.
so how do I keep this short? But Jim Crow is, um, separate but equal, where equal is not really equal. So separate water fountains, separate bathrooms, separate churches, separate institutions, again, so prisons, schools, large organizations. And I guess sticking with our theme here tonight, separate schools. So people will, of color, will have different teachers that will also be of color. And they won't have the same training, they won't have the same education themselves. And then again, that access to good materials, access to textbooks and reading, but very simply. And then moving a little forward into redlining. So we advance a little bit as a country. And then I think redlining really starts with banks. So they wanted ways to divide up who can get a loan and who cannot. So a city would be literally divided up with a red pen on a map, and box out areas that a bank would approve a loan or not. And it just so happened that areas and neighborhoods with lots of people of color would
It
be
just so
denied.
happened that
Yes, it just so happened that these neighborhoods and these people would be denied loans. Um, and then how this also works and ties into schools. So education is traditionally funded by income tax. So in the public school setting, if we have people with lower incomes and paying a lower income tax, then that school or that district is going to get significantly less money. And I think we all pretty much know how that works with resources. So they're not going to
So they're
get
not getting those housing loans. They're not getting their small business loans.
Yep.
They don't have any way to advance financially because they're not being supported by the financial system.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about systemic racism. This is one of the systems we're talking about, is financial system.
Yeah, exactly.
But then we divide our school districts up in those same districts.
Yeah, exactly.
And now our kids without access to financial resources are being put in schools together, and kids with access to financial resources are putting in their own schools together because they're
Mm-hmm.
literally following the boundaries of that red line on the map, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Exactly.
So that's redlining. Um, yeah, I stopped you there to explain redlining. And if you have any more questions about that, if that's confusing, go ahead and drop your questions in the comments. We're paying attention to that. We're following that. So if you have any more questions, but we'll keep moving forward. So you were starting to get into then the unequitable distribution of resources in the schools.
Yeah. So if these schools are funded by lower amounts of money, lower amounts of resources, so obviously going to be significantly less resources, which again conveniently happens to be segregated into people who are wealthy and don't have much melanin and people that look like myself. So they're not getting access to tutors. They're not getting textbooks, if any books at all. They're not fully staffed. So we have teachers that are already underpaid and underappreciated. So now even less of them, and they're being asked more of to educate students who probably didn't have a better education coming up. And everyone gets spread thin from upper administration all the way down. And that is very much a system built to oppress a group, which is racism.
All right, so we already see here the foundation for unequal. So even if we look at separate but equal, we're not even able to maintain that. There is no separate but equal because there's no equal resources on both sides of this equation. So now we're integrated, supposedly, but we have these red line districts and still don't see equal resources being shared. And so, what does that mean for how to bring us up to like the current day? So, redlining has been around for how long?
Years, maybe 70
Has it
years,
been
80,
50,
maybe a little
60,
longer.
70 years?
I don't know exactly, so I don't want to say a number, but probably around 70,
We don't know
80.
the exact history of that, but a long time. So
I don't
how
know
has
the
that
date.
played out now where our schools are slightly more integrated, but how do we still see the effects of that now?
Well, I think now we're seeing some residual effects of that. Obviously, it's not as significant as far as resources being limited. However, there are still several school districts in areas that you can still very, very clearly see this. Perfect example of this is our cities. Um, our city schools are more often than not known as being less academically successful than our county schools, or
Okay.
schools in.
So academic success and expectation, that was another thing we wanted to hit on. So you don't have equal resources. You can't be as successful because the teachers don't have the resources to teach. The students don't even have the teachers they need that are getting paid well enough to support them. So now their academic performance is lower than these other schools that have more resources. So what happens
Yeah,
when we do start saying, "Hey, we got to get some diversity," and we'll talk about that word diversity in a minute, right? But so, hey, we got to get some diversity. We're going to start mixing these students. Then what happens when these students who have these lower academic achievements land in these classrooms?
yeah, absolutely. I think that we compound that with almost a social, there's a social thing there. Um,
So by social, you
because
mean we're looking at socioeconomic
yeah,
structure.
we're looking at a socioeconomic statuses, and then we even get into some classism, and I think all of that can very, very easily get confused and muddled up because it's very similar. Um,
Yeah, so you have maybe rural white areas where they have some similar issues in terms of resourcing to urban areas with students of color. So we have a class there. You see the class issue where the classes are kind of on the same level
yeah,
here,
yeah,
um, and it's not about race. It is. It's always about race, but it's not just about race at that point.
yes, correct. I think that's the best way to say it. It's
So
not just
talk
about race.
practically for our teachers who are watching this about what happens when you have these students in your classroom whose academic performance has been low because of their lack of resources. And maybe even now they're integrated, they're into a better school system, but their family is still living in poverty or living in conditions where they don't have the technology at home, they're not succeeding at home. So what happens when that student is sitting in the classroom? How does the teacher interact with that student?
So I think it's one, I think awareness and education is everything. So if a teacher or instructor is able to understand that and really see that, I think that is a huge step. And then I think taking the next step would be finding ways to get that student resources to get caught up. And that's not easy by any means at all. I mean, it starts in pre-K, kindergarten, second grade, first grade, like when students are really learning simple stuff like the ABCs, how to read, how to do simple math, addition, subtraction. And like we see these disparities like on a pretty large scale, I would like to say. So then by the time they get to middle school or high school, their education is just so far behind to a pretty significant point that they need a lot of catching up. And then they're compared and they're expected to operate on a level that these students that have had quality education, when that's just not realistic, that's not possible. So I think educators, it's hard because even in areas where there is money and there is affluency, there's still educators still not given enough resources to complete their job.
So any
So
educator ideally would see the socioeconomic impact of each of their students and help to build resources for their students in ways they can.
yeah, yeah,
Let's
absolutely.
talk. Go ahead.
And again, I think it comes back to people in power deciding to make a decision. This is a problem. Let's change it. let's get these students the resources that they need to get caught up, or even better, let's get these students the resources early on.
Which we've been trying to do, with Head Start programs and preschool programs. That attempt has been made, so it sounds like we still have some work to do. Um, let's see. So Melanie's saying acknowledgement that the student is not being the teacher's adversary, but has a different lifestyle, and the teacher needs to accommodate that. You want to talk? You want to talk? Speak to that comment? Do you feel like sometimes teachers see students of lower performance or lower socioeconomic conditions as being adversarial? And why would they appear adversarial?
So this is, I think that's a loaded question, but I think that like also comes into, like we were saying, a little bit of psychology there. Becomes almost a social thing. Like if I'm the significantly further behind everybody in the classroom, and I don't look like anybody, my culture at home is not like anybody, but I'm expected to maintain a certain standard, a certain expectation, I'm going to shut down. I'm going to
You'll probably
completely
go
shut
one way or
down.
the other as a student. You'll either shut down or you'll become a behavior problem.
Yeah, exactly. And
Distraction.
exactly, especially in those earlier behavioral developmental stages.
So
Different
those are
people are
red
going to
flags that
respond.
teachers can look for is, are your students shutting down? Are they behavior problem? And instead of treating it as behavior problems, asking the question, why? What's going on?
Yeah,
Why isn't this student able to function in my classroom?
absolutely. My students coming to class and sleeping every day, or just not coming to class. I mean, that's the behavior. That's the reaction. So what was the stimulus? It's a stimulus. They
Yeah,
don't understand the
when I worked in a high school special ed department, I had a student who used to come in. I was just teachers. I was just a aide. But there was a student who used to come into our classroom every morning, put his head down on the desk, and just sleep for the whole class. And we could have considered that a behavior problem, but what we knew about that student was that his mom was a single mom. She was dying of cancer, and this kid was working a night shift to support his family, to support his mom and his siblings. Um, so yeah, asking why is this going on, and then figuring out how we can offer support into situations like that, because that's not uncommon. You're going to have kids in a lower socioeconomic class, especially in the high school, who are working a job or two and trying to maintain their education. Um, all right, so Melissa's an educator. This validates what's happening in my school. I work in a Title I school in affluent Howard County. We spend a lot of time meeting needs of our families like food insecurity, school supplies, books, technology access, and those basic needs must be met before we can address their academic needs. She said she also had a student sleep in class, um, and needed to ask why. So, yeah, when we're dealing with food insecurity in kids in the school, they can't learn an empty stomach.
yeah.
So how do we handle those kinds of issues? It feels like the schools are beginning to. It feels like some schools forced to, because of the population of their district, forced to focus more on just meeting those basic needs. Do you think that might be true?
Yeah, unfortunately, because it's a lot. Like that's why we call this thing systemic, because it's the entire system. I think it's so broken, and it's hard to it's going to take like an entire uprising. Like everything has to be flipped upside down and reset so we can do this right. But yeah, like I completely agree.
In that case, we're
It's
asking teachers to be social workers first
exactly,
before they get to be teachers.
exactly. And when they're already not compensated enough, already not given the resources enough just to teach, how can we now ask them to do all this other stuff while still giving students that are already ahead and where they need to be the attention and education they need?
Right. So let's go back and talk about. So we've gotten deep into all these systems.
Yeah,
We're seeing how one system is connected to another, and Melissa's asking, how do we change the system? I don't know the answers to that. Have you seen good answers to that out there?
it, I think it's going to come down to money, like lots of things does, and
So allocation
resources.
of resources.
So like, where are we allocating these resources? There's money, but is it going into the right spots? And then the people who are deciding where that money goes, those are the people in power. So again,
So we're back to what we were talking last week about who's at the table. Are these people with these big needs being represented at the table where the decisions are being made? Or are decisions being made for them by people who have no connection to their experience?
yeah, exactly. And do the people in power understand this? And do they see that as an issue? And then not only because it's a system, it cycles all the way through. So those people in power, they had access to all this. They got a good education. They went to college. They got multiple degrees. They're
So
well
the system
studied.
worked for those people.
Yep.
So
And
why
there
would
was
they
never,
change it? Why would they
yeah,
see any needs that are different than what they experience?
yep. Perception is reality.
Yeah, it's a big question. So I want to go back to, we said we were going to talk about diversity in schools. Just talk about how you feel about that word diversity.
It's a so the word diversity, it's very complex, and I think can be used in a lot of different ways. Um, like I was just saying, like we could be talking about diversity of hair, diversity of eye color, and I think something that myself included, getting we get in a bad habit of doing is saying diversity, but then we don't necessarily define what kind of diversity are we talking about.
So if we're talking about increasing racial diversity in the schools, how does that phrase sit with you?
Yes. So great, we're increasing diversity. All right. What is it? Inclusive environment. Is it an environment that is set up to support these students and staff and faculty? So again, it's the entire system that
So
needs to
you're
be.
separating out diversity from inclusion.
Yes,
So we might have a diverse population now in our school, but are they being included in all the opportunities equally?
exactly. And then like we have, before we can have diversity, we need inclusion. So I think like diversity cannot be the reason that we decide to then go and get inclusivity, if that makes sense.
So say it, flip it the other way.
What do you mean?
Make it about inclusion first, then what does that look like? So we can see what you mean.
So inclusion, I think, is a broad term as well. Um, so I think when I personally think of inclusion, I think of like the environment, the atmosphere that is accepting and welcoming and open to individuals.
Yeah. So Sherry
Um,
just said beyond inclusion, are they accepted? And I think Sherry, that's what he means by inclusion, is that
yeah,
there's acceptance, uh, there's a true bringing together of their experiences, and there's conversation, and they're just being included, as opposed to
yeah,
your experience in high school where you ate lunch in Little Africa while the white students eat
like,
somewhere else in the cafeteria, right? That's not inclusion. That might
no,
demonstrate a little bit of diversity in your student body, but it's not inclusion, right?
yeah, correct.
Um, do you think things and concepts that help inclusion might also help out with diversity? So, yeah, I think that's what you were getting at, right, JC, is that inclusion has to come first and diversity will follow.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So like, I think like any of us, if we are presented with an option that's warm and welcoming and accepting versus an option that's not so much that, I think we, all of us, I hope, would choose the former and choose that
Great. So
environment that's welcoming.
here's something that we've talked a lot about is so you're this is one of those little one of the things that white people don't get, right? So you were in human services in college, and almost all of your classmates were female, right? So
Counseling,
you
human
talked about
services, yes.
anything that had to do were white females. Almost all of your classmates were white females, right? So anything that had to do with race or with men, what would
Mm,
happen?
yeah, yes. JT, what's
Everybody
the
would
answer?
want you to answer that question.
Yeah,
So how
yeah,
should that go? Like that's like over including almost, right? That's like making you the token representative, whatever your diversity category is.
that's a tough one.
You got all the adoption ones too in your classes in social
Oh
services
yeah,
class.
yeah,
So,
yeah, it's a tough one.
well, what would you rather they do instead of everybody just automatically looking at the token person in the classroom who represents whatever topic you're talking about? What should they be doing?
Learning and educating themselves. I mean, just like this, I don't want, a person of color should never have to be put in a position where they're educating and teaching non-people of color about race issues. That's not a comfortable position to put them in. It's not fair to them because, to be completely frank, black people are not the ones that cause this problem. So why should they have to be the ones to fix it?
And then we come back around to white fragility a little bit, right? Like, oh, not my problem. I can't really look at this. I'm just going to look to you, answer my question, then I'll go back to my happy little thought process. I'm kind of probably going to be a little more harsh about it than you are.
Probably.
um, let's see. So we have a couple more comments. We have an incredibly diverse student population in the high school where I work. The staff is not diverse. Little representation and
Yep.
conversation, including the stories of our minorities. Discussions regarding current justice issues are directed toward our all-white male social studies department. There we go. So you have the department in the school that's in charge of having these conversations. And that's another thing we talked about, right? Why is Black history taught in 1 month out of the year, right? Why that's another piece of inclusion is including Black stories, including Latino stories, including stories of sexually diverse students and people, including women's stories. We're not real good at that yet. How
Yeah.
so a school like this, what do you think they should be doing about this?
So again, the people in power, I'm going to keep saying it till I'm blue in the face, because the people in power need to look at their hiring practices and whatever else is going on, and they need to figure out, why is our staff not representative of our student body?
And again, it's systemic, right? So your
Yep.
principals to be the most educated, they're going to be the most ones with the longest job experience, and they're
Well,
probably going to be
educated is relative.
at this point white women, maybe. What's that?
Educated is relative.
Yeah. So we have to catch up. There needs to be a catching up point. Um, so how do we share the burden without talking over top of or eliminating BIPOC voices? If you want us to own our education, how do we have that conversation? You know, just asking that question shows that we don't know how to have a conversation with a person of color. We don't know how to have conversations. Like it's just a matter of having a conversation. It shouldn't matter that, JT is the only Black voice in the class. We as a class, as teachers, we should be teaching our class how to talk to each other, how every person's uh, forming their own opinion, their own judgments, their own understandings, including JT in that classroom. Um, we um, we just need to learn how to have a conversation. We don't know how to talk to each other anymore. We're afraid of offending each other. Um, but when we
We
just
don't like
when we just
discomfort.
share our experience,
Yeah, I think that's a skill that we all can work on, like every single one of us. Getting better at having difficult conversations and learning how to be a little uncomfortable
do you feel like
and
I feel
being
like your
willing to be
generation is
challenged.
better at it than my generation?
I don't know how you would compare that.
In
Possibly,
in
maybe.
terms of having conversations, or is it just that you guys tend to surround yourselves with more open-minded peers? Maybe I don't know.
We also, again, access, like my generation has so much more access. Like I had the opportunity to be exposed to a whole lot more. I have a whole lot more at my fingertips than you were when you were my age or younger. Like the fact I have Google in my pocket at all times, or social media in my pocket at all times. Like I have so much more. So I think that might play a role in that.
Right, and then that has to do with socioeconomic status again and access. So you had access to all white resources. You had access to the expectation that you would go to college and
Yeah.
even earn a higher degree, not just get a bachelor's, get a master's, maybe get a doctorate, right? So that's in your family heritage, in your adopted family
Pedigree.
heritage.
That, yeah. And I mean, like if I thought about it quite a bit. Like if I was never adopted by you, if I stayed with my family of origin, most I can't say one way or the other, but would I have thought it as a norm that I would go to college? So I mean, growing up, like you and dad both went to very good schools. You went to freaking Ivy League for your graduate degree. Grandparents went to good schools. Several people in the family are doctors. So like for me growing up, college was just, something that you do. You go to high school, you graduate, you go to college, you get your master's, then you get your doctorate. That just was a norm.
You're frozen. So the next part of the conversation is what it would have looked like if you had been with your birth family, and it would have been very different. Hoping will come back to us. JT Austin. Um, yeah, Laura, that's a good question. Why is Black history taught separately from history? I have some thoughts about that. I'd love to hear JT's thoughts about it. And it looks like he's going to leave and come back in. Um, I think there's a lot of history. There's a lot of Black history that we don't want to teach in the schools. We don't want people aware of. And so we relegate it to the 1 month where it's allowed to be talked about. You can't fit all that into 1 month. So we're safe, right? That's how I see that. I mean, we're talking about Laura's question of why is Black history taught separately from history? Why do we have Black History Month? Why don't we just integrate? Why? What even got it separated out in the first place? It's
They
who
don't
wrote
want
the
our voices
books,
to be
right?
heard. Yeah. Like who wrote the dictionary? Merriam-Webster. Who's Merriam-Webster? Rich white people, rich white family. They define everything for us. Same thing with textbooks. The textbooks will define everything for us. So we're gonna tell stories of our own people, and maybe not from the nicest lens. And I think that's something like I think that's something that our culture struggles, our American culture struggles with as a whole, like not necessarily being realistic with ourselves in terms of our origins, where we came from, how we got there.
Yeah, what was done to our indigenous people? What was done? The fact that our Black population is here because most of them were enslaved. Um, we don't talk about we don't want to talk about that, so we don't ask the question. Dacia says learning to have conversations and especially listening to the other person's story without having to insert ourselves into their narrative. So, yeah, even as a white person, creating our own narrative, but creating it in conversation with people who have different story than we do. What do you think about that, JT?
I think listening is probably one of the most powerful tools anyone can learn to use. Like, I think like you can learn to sit down with somebody, even if it's just for 10 minutes, and just listen without saying a single word. That conversation could be so much more impactful than a conversation where it's 50-50. Just learning to listen, saying, okay, yeah, and maybe asking a couple questions.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Stephen Covey, and
Yeah.
his one principle of seek first to understand and then to be
Yep.
understood. So, the point of a conversation is to understand what your, conversant partner is talking about, and then to get your point across, but not until you understand what else is going on.
Yeah.
Um, so what was it like to be a black student? Now, we have an interesting situation because I homeschooled, so I've never had, um, I went to public school. I've homeschooled you, all your siblings. Some of your siblings have never been to public school. A couple now have been to college out of homeschooling. You were homeschooled until high school, and then you wanted to play sports. So you were in public school, but only for high school, and then college for your bachelor's and your master's degree, and now you're working at a different university. So what going from homeschooling to high school in terms of seeing yourself as a black person, how did that work for you? How much of that?
I think it was tough, and I think it was a lot harder than I allowed myself to feel like it was, or admit that it was. Um, Especially a school like I went to that was so affluent and so white, just white. And then going from being homeschooled in middle school, where it's virtually you and I banging our heads together, to all of a sudden being in a school with 1,500 students, majority of them don't look like me, don't have this anything similar to the same background as I do.
And being on the soccer team,
And then,
which most of the soccer teams you played either in, with, against have been mostly white boys.
yeah, yeah. And I mean, I've never even thought about this, but now thinking about it, probably the most, I did not get a diverse soccer team until I went to college and got to play with a few guys that from out of the country.
So that's interesting too. We've had this conversation. So why are we talking about black people? We used to talk about African Americans, right? And we'll get, you hear this question. I thought you wanted to be called African Americans. Why do you want to be called black people now? So answer that question because this showed up in your soccer team.
Like you want me to define it or what?
Yeah, just define it.
So the reason we say black is because of slavery. Like many things, um, there's just a mix of so many different areas from Africa. It's hard to trace that lineage back to one spot. So the term
And
becomes
we do
black.
now have African immigrants. We have quite a population of African immigrants who are
Yeah,
African Americans, who are
American. Yeah,
African immigrants to America.
yeah, and they can trace their lineage back to somewhere in Africa.
So there's big cultural differences there, right? So and this is what I mean. So you would play with some African boys on the soccer teams. There's a difference between the African American experience, which is really like a first generation, second generation immigrant experience, and the black experience.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Talk
There's
about that a little bit.
I mean, especially in the African culture, there's a lot stronger sense of culturism, familiarism in those cultures. Not to say that the black culture doesn't have that. But I mean, I think you said it best. It's very similar to an experience of a first or second generation immigrant. Like that's all you have. You move to a new country and that's all you have.
So they're still very connected to their home culture,
Yes.
Africa.
Hmm.
Here it's become even black culture is very diverse. There's a lot of indigenous in there. There's a lot of racial mixing that's happened. There's a lot of issues around because of
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. And I think the other thing is like African culture comes from Africa and their societal norms, and the Black culture comes from slavery and what Black people have endured here in America the past several years.
Oh, I was just thinking of an example of taking over a student's narrative. Do you know what I'm talking? Do you know what I'm going to talk about here? Because you had an African peer on the track team, and they decided to highlight her story. I'm
Mm.
not going to name names here, but so the athletic
Oh.
department decided to highlight her story, and it was told entirely by the white coaches. Her story was told by the white coaches. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Mhm.
You don't want to, if you don't want to go there, you don't have to. But talk about
I,
like Daisha was saying, us taking over someone else's narrative. Like that was like
yeah.
this feel good story about we have this immigrant student from Africa. She had some really difficult experiences, and we're going to tell her story. We're going to put her on video. We're going to show her run on the track, but it's going to be my voice, my white male voice, narrating her story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we can avoid taking over the narrative in some really obvious ways
Yeah.
there.
Well, like, I mean, that something like that is simple. Like, maybe ask the student if that's something they would like to share with the world before we decide to make her a token of inspiration. But she's very admirable and she is an inspiration, but that was her story to tell or not tell.
Yeah. And that got commandeered for the cause.
To make someone else look better.
Okay. I think, well, we're coming up to about an hour. I'm gonna, if you all have more questions or comments you want to bring up. I think we've covered a lot of what we were hoping to cover. We were hoping to have some more specific questions to answer too, because we know some of you are educators who are in school systems. And it's such a big topic. It's so huge. But I think our main goal is helping people understand what we mean by systemic racism and how problems in the school didn't start a generation ago. They started a long time ago when we started shepherding
Telling Black
populations
people they can't go to school. Yeah.
separate into their own separate areas. The one thing that we did talk about that I wanted to bring up was in the classroom the expectation. So there are teachers who will have a lower expectation of students, and how does that affect the student performance? Does that happen, and how does that affect the student?
I think that's like a hidden or implicit bias. So a lot of times, I mean, an instructor or an educator doesn't know that they have that bias within them to assume or think that a student of color is going to do less than a white student might do. Personally, like from my own personal experiences in high school, in college, even grad school, like I'm not looked at as someone who's going to be at the top of the class. And a lot of times I never was until grad school. But it's tough. Like you're already set 10 meters behind everybody else in the race. And you're not expected to do well. And maybe the instructor is not going to pour in as much as I'm going to pour into a white student. And they're not even going to know it. They're not even going to realize they're doing it. They're not going to be coming to JT and say, what do you think of the lesson today?
But they will ask you how you performed on the field last night for your game.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And I think I saw that the most when I was in college, when I was doing a lot for the institution on the soccer field or on the track. Like that's what instructors saw me as, and I was not really valued for what I could bring to the classroom. So like I would walk into class and the teacher would say hi to everybody. They'll start talking about school or careers with these other students, and they'll ask me about, oh, how was your meet last weekend? I saw you did really well.
Yeah, so that's an implicit bias that people aren't even aware
Mhm.
they're participating in.
Yeah.
They're going to make an assumption that the sports are the more important thing to talk to you about
Yeah.
instead of the
Yeah.
academic performance.
Hmm.
And again, that's an inclusion conversation, right? So you're
Yeah.
great. We're going to talk about diversity issues or male issues or adoption issues. Otherwise, how are you doing on the field? How are you doing on the track?
Yeah. Absolutely. And I mean, to an extent, like, yeah, I did identify largely as an athlete because that's what I was good at. And no one ever really promoted me in my academics either. Like I wasn't seen as valuable like I was seen as valued on the soccer field or the track. Like no one ever sought after me, called me, sent me mail to come to the school for academics. I was just seeing like, what can I do for the team? Can I help them win championships?
Yeah, so that opens a whole other issue is sports and academics,
Yeah.
which is loaded with racial stuff, racial
Yeah.
biases. Um, so we can save that for another time. But that is for educators who are listening. Is something you can watch for in yourself, and you can watch for in your peers and in your administration. Is does that implicit bias exist? Am I making a token out of one of my students simply because of the population they come from, the whatever diverse population they represent? Am I making assumptions about what's important to them?
Yeah.
Or am I actually having the conversation? Hey,
Yeah.
you tell me what's important to you. You write the story, and I'll support you in that. I think you
Yeah. I
had
think,
some teachers in high school who did do that.
oh, yeah. Like Coach Tully, I'll give him a shout out. Did a great job at that. Coach Gunter. I've been very
They were
fortunate to have.
coaches and they were teachers, and they pushed you just as hard academically as they did on the field
Yeah.
or on the track. Yeah.
Yeah. If not harder academically.
Yeah. All right. I think we're going to wrap it up. And if you're enjoying these conversations, we'll keep them up. We might not be able to do it next Friday, but we'll let you know here what we're doing. Again, if you're getting value out of these conversations, please share the video with whoever you think needs to listen to it. We're really trying to talk to white people, honestly. So JT's has the advantage of having grown up in a white family and the advantages that come with that. There's disadvantages that come with that in terms of his own identity. Um, so we're going to ride the advantages here on Facebook and give him a platform to speak about his experience. Yeah. Anything you want to, last words you want to say about this topic?
I feel like we could talk about it for hours, and we could do an entire other episode.
Oh, we lost your sound for some reason. Just turn your mic off. Yeah, we don't have sound. I can't hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes. There we go. All right, last words.
I was just saying I think we covered a lot, and I think we could still cover a lot. But I think it was a good start, and we gave a lot of background as to why things are the way they are, and sort of breached the topic of systemic racism. Like this is an entire system. There's not necessarily something wrong with people in a certain position. It's the system, which I think that's something important to keep in mind. It's not the person, it's not the principles. They contribute and they have influence to either positively or negatively impact this, but it's a system. So we need to look at it like that.
Yep. And eventually, we'll open up conversation about the Black Lives Movement, which just has a whole lot of emotion behind it. So we're trying to lay the foundation of why are Black people angry? Why are they protesting? What is going on there? By kind of uncovering all these places where systemic racism exists and has existed for generations, for centuries, really, in this country. And we're only centuries old, so it's pretty bad. All right, dude.
All
I
right.
love you. Thanks for
All
talking
right.
to me.
Yeah.
Hey, folks.
All right. Bye.